week in 1919. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas and works alongside my husband Elliot, who wrote this introduction. From this point on. No, yeah, right, yeah, you know. Disclaimer. Mike is a specialist in labor history and the author of Striking with the Ballot, Ohio Labor and the Populist Party, as well as several journal articles and chapters in books. And since coming here in 2001, he has retooled to become as well a specialist in Arkansas history, and in particular, its history of racial relations. He has received a number of awards for this work, including in 2014, Fulbright College's Faculty Award from the Omni Center for Peace, Justice, and Equality. As a member of a department frequently recognized for the quality of its teaching, Mike sets an imposing standard. When his colleagues on the executive committee see the scores on his students' evaluations, they stare down at their shoes in shame and envy. Elliot writes, he is also a fine and generous colleague and academic and community citizen. Welcome, Professor Mike Pierce.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Elliot, if you're watching somewhere, Elliot, I hear, is out in Pasadena. He's at a library called the Huntington Library. If you ever have seen The Good Place, the TV show, the Huntington Library is where they film Heaven. Seriously. So that's where Elliot is right now. So we understand why he would prefer to watch this online. But thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to everyone at St. Paul's for making this possible, but more importantly for engaging in the type of meaningful dialogue that is necessary for people to become good citizens and to help make this community and state and nation better. The title of my talk, Elaine Race Massacre, America's Most Violent Suppression of Organized Workers. It is, in a way, if I was giving this at an academic venue, this would be a provocative title. And what I'm trying to say here is that we cannot think of the Elaine Race Massacre simply in terms of race relations. The victims at Elaine were not killed and not sent to prison because they were African American. They were not sent to prison or killed because they were trade unionists. They were victimized because they were black trade unionists. You cannot separate these two things. African Americans just living their daily lives, actually they became victims in the hysteria, but they were not the targets. And so what we have to do is we have to think long and hard and why this is the case. If you show me the next slide. A little bit to think about. The Elaine Massacre happened in a 3 or 4 day period about 100 years ago, from September 30th, the evening of September 30th, until the arrival of federal troops in Elaine coming from Camp Pike on October 3rd. Somewhere between 200 and 300 African Americans were killed in this violence, where gangs of whites came from all over the Delta, both sides of the Mississippi, to hunt down Union members, and a mania came over them, and there was indiscriminate violence. 200 to 300. We don't know the number, largely because at this time black people did not count. And so you did not count black deaths. There are rumors in Phillips County of mass graves of hundreds of people. We don't know, and we just never will. Additionally, in hastily arranged trials that were later declared by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, 75 people were put in the penitentiary. 75 people were put in the penitentiary, and 12 people who refused to plead guilty were sentenced to death. The Elaine Massacre happened in 1919. And part of this is we have to understand that in 1919, all over the nation was a summer of violence called the Red Summer. There are race riots, race and labor riots throughout the South. In 1919, more Americans went out on strike than any other year in American history. General strikes in Seattle, the big steel and coal strikes, all of these were accompanied by violence. But the causes of the Elaine Massacre are unique to what happened in Elaine. And we have to look at the roots of this in Arkansas history and the history of the Delta and the history of sharecropping. The spark of all of this in Elaine was the formation of a union. It's called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. After the end of World War I, this union was revitalized. It received a new charter. And this man on the right, his name is Robert Hill, he's the one who did it. He formed it in Drew County, actually in the northeast section of Drew County. And what he wanted to do is to use that union for racial uplift, to grab citizenship rights for African Americans, to secure their economic rights. By the way, this is a picture of Robert Hill. This is his picture. This comes from the 1930s. After the Elaine events, and we can talk about this later if you want, he fled. He was never arrested. He fled to Topeka. And the Kansas governor refused to extradite him. And he just works in Topeka. And the Depression comes, and Farm Security Administration photographers, you know, Ben Shahn and Dorothea Lange, that group is going through Topeka, and they just take his picture. And so we have a picture of him. It's quite amazing. Next. So why? This is related to sharecropping. It's related, this union is to address the needs of sharecroppers. Sharecropping emerges in Arkansas in the late 1860s as a result of the end of the Civil War. We think of sharecropping now as a form of peonage, as something that is akin to slavery. But originally, sharecropping was a compromise. It was a compromise between the demands for African Americans for 40 acres and a mule and the demands of the landowners to go back to the pre-Civil War status quo. And the way sharecropping was worked, plantations were divided, and individual families of freed men and women were given 40-acre plots. The land was owned by the landowner, but on those 40-acre plots, the sharecroppers farmed them as their own. And at the end of the season, sharecroppers got about half the crop, landowners the other half. And this was a profitable arrangement when cotton prices were high. It allowed African Americans to control their own labor on a daily basis, to take women out of the labor force, to send their kids to school. It is transformed, though, in the 1870s and the 1880s as cotton prices fall. And as cotton prices fall, the planters, and the planters are organized, the Democratic Party is a party of planters and their allies. The Democrats, they remake the laws about sharecropping so that, so that the landowners are made whole. And the falling cotton prices fall on the sharecroppers. And by the way, sharecroppers were lots of African Americans, but also whites. This was, and so falling cotton prices. And this leads to what is known as agrarian radicalism. And agrarian radicalism in the United States, especially in the South, the Cotton South, is a movement of poor white farmers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers, and poor black sharecroppers and tenant farmers and landowners. It is a biracial movement. There's organizations, the Agricultural Wheel, the Knights of Labor, that these poor blacks and poor white agricultural people join and use to redress their needs. And the Agricultural Wheel and the Knights of Labor in 1886 form a new political party in Arkansas, the Union Labor Party. And this Union Labor Party is trying to change sharecropping, trying to make sure that the people who actually toil the land reap the benefit of the harvest. And they make a series of demands. The Democrats respond to the, by the way, and then the Union Labor Party makes, they fuse with the Republican Party, the traditional party of African Americans, and they run joint tickets in 1888 and 1890. What did the Democrats do? They stop blacks from voting. They throw black ballots into rivers. They assassinate Union Labor Party GOP candidates. They respond to this black-white, biracial, working-class alliance by violence. And it is at that time, when this is all happening, violence is becoming endemic. And in 1891, in Lee County, Monroe County, African American cotton pickers decide that they are going to go on strike. They are going to go on strike, and they decide that they are going to demand higher wages. They announce, we're not going to pick cotton. And in 1891, after this is announced, 57 cotton pickers are killed. And so Elaine does not happen in a vacuum. And so this alliance of working class whites and working class blacks are making progress. And the Democrats are cheating. And so what do the Democrats do? The Democrats at this time, this is the rise of Jim Crow. This is when disfranchisement happens in Arkansas. Jim Crow and disfranchisement are the elite's efforts, the Democratic Party's efforts to prevent poor whites and poor blacks from forming an alliance to redress their needs. And through a series of events and a series of laws, including one that was authored by the president of the University of Arkansas, whites and blacks were separated in public life. Voting for African Americans and poor whites became substantially harder through poll taxes, ballot reforms, and Jim Crow and disfranchisement a response to labor organizing. Next. It is this period of the 1890s to the 1910s that is the period of what, I don't want to say this, it's not the heyday of lynching. It's when lynching becomes an acceptable, for white people, it becomes an acceptable way to police the activities of African Americans. It's also the time in which peonage becomes widespread. And peonage is where workers become unfree through debt. And and the way sharecropping worked, I mean, sharecroppers only were paid once a year. And the way sharecropping was working is the landowner marketed the crop. And the sharecropper would go to the landowner and say, I need food for the next 4 months. And the landowner would basically give it as a loan to be paid back at harvest time. The landowner kept the books. The landowner determined the prices. And after every harvest, the landowner, I'm sorry to pick on you, I'll pick on her. The landowner said, no, you're still in debt. And if you're in debt, you can't sign another contract without my permission. If you're in debt, you cannot leave the county without my permission. And so debt and peonage were ways to keep African American sharecroppers and white sharecroppers low-waged, attached to the land. People talk about it as being akin to slavery. It's actually different than slavery. Slavery was 15 times worse. Okay, you can't quantify, but it was much, much worse. Also, at this time, all throughout the nation, violence was being celebrated as a progressive force. This is when social Darwinism and scientific racism were having its heyday. And if you think, I mean, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, conflict, these things lead to progress. So struggle equals progress. Violence equals progress. And so for white people who look like me, we came to see violence as necessary for the advancement of the human race. And we cannot disengage the racial violence in places like the Arkansas Delta to these ideas of social Darwinism. You can't. And social Darwinism's close relative is, of course, laissez-faire economics, where the life is advanced through struggle, through the marketplace. These things are all entwined with each other. This all changes in many ways during the Great War. World War I. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson goes before Congress and asks for a declaration of war. He says, the United States will be fighting for those things that we have always held dearest. He says, it is the right of people to determine their own government and to choose their own government. The right of people to participate in the democratic processes. And if you're an African American who's disenfranchised in the South, This is both kind of ironic, but it's also a time of hope. The nation committing its national purpose to self-determination. Maybe the nation will realize the folly of its ways. And African Americans signed up to fight in greater numbers. This was a chance to prove to the nation that we are citizens. We will fight and we will defend our nation, and that we are worthy of votes and economic opportunity. This is Corporal Leroy Johnston. He went off, he fought in Europe. During the Elaine Race Massacre, he was pulled off a train along with his brothers. They were in a car with a deputy sheriff. And all four of them were basically killed. And so this is one of the victims of the Elaine. The other thing that is happening during the war is where are the farmers of England and France and Germany? They're on the front lines. And the United States becomes the source of food, the source of fiber. And the war itself creates this huge demand for cotton goods. And so what you see is the price of all agricultural goods skyrocket during the war. Actually, the growth starts in 1914 when Europe goes to war. And then it increases when the United States joins. And so cotton prices go up. There's hope. And the last thing that happens, the war stimulated what is known as the Great Migration. It is the migration of African Americans, but also poor white Southerners from rural areas to the urban north and the urban west. What happens, the outbreak of war in Europe stops the flow of immigrants from Europe. Immigrants who had occupied the bottom rungs in industrial society. The war creates this huge demand for industrial goods. At the same time, the supply of labor stops. And so labor recruiters go to the South. And they give African Americans railroad passes. They give them addresses. You come to Chicago, there's a job waiting. We will pay you cash. And they told, and black newspapers would have, like, they would say, poor people of the South, poor brethren, come to Chicago, public schools. They would run pictures of the public library and say, this is open to black people too, and the hospital. And this is the beginning of a migration. It provides all of these things, the war, patriotism, rising crop prices, the opportunity afforded by migration means that the war for African Americans in the Delta provides hope. A promise of a better life. Next slide. November 11th, 1918, Armistice signed. The war is over. And in places like Phillips County, Arkansas, there is a new fight, a fight over the peace. What the world will look like moving forward. And for African Americans, the sharecroppers, they want to continue. The war created hopes of citizenship, of economic opportunity, and they wanted to continue that. For the planters, for their allies, for the bankers and the elite, for the Democratic politicians, what did they want to do after the war? They wanted to act like the war never happened. They want to go back to the pre-war status quo. And what happens at Elaine has to be understood within this context of the end of the Great War. Next slide. It's at this time that the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America arrives in Phillips County. And the union comes to embody all of the hopes of the African American sharecroppers. Citizenship rights, economic opportunity. And what they said is we have to act collectively, not as individuals. We have to join together. And one of the things they did is they hired a lawyer to look at sharecropping contracts and make sure that sharecropping contracts were enforced. Next slide. That's the lawyer. His name is Ulysses Simpson Bratton. He was living in Helena, outside of near Elaine. If you're named after U.S. Grant in the South and you're a white person, that's always a sign. But he's a lawyer, and he was working with the union, and what he found out is that the typical sharecropper in Phillips County made about 15 bales of cotton a year. Did about 15 acres, 1 acre of land, 1 bale of cotton. 1 bale of cotton is $225. Value of the sharecropper's crop was $3,375. Half of that, $1,687. In 1918, if you made $1,600 a year, you could buy 4 automobiles. You would make more than a public school teacher. You would make more than a skilled tradesman. You would make more than a bank clerk. This would put you in that respectable high middle class range. But the sharecroppers knew if they simply gave the cotton to the landowner, they would be told, you barely broke even. You're still in debt. So Bratton was to go to court to enforce the contracts. And by the way, there's a federal anti-peonage law. And what happens on September 30th, 1919, in a place called Hoop's Spur? Next slide. Thank you. In a place called Hoop's Spur, a white posse, 150 people, went to raid a union meeting. Everyone was armed, both black and white. White people say the blacks started firing shots. Union members say the whites started firing shots. One member of the posse, he was a railroad detective. He had a badge, was killed. And rumors spread that whites in Elaine, Arkansas, were arming themselves for an insurrection to wipe out all of the white people. And gangs of white people from Marianna, Clarendon, crossed the river in Mississippi. They descended upon Phillips County, and for 3 days they tried to hunt down Union members. And hysteria took over, and they killed other people as well. That is the Elaine Race Massacre. By the way, how do we know all of this stuff? White people said that it's an insurrection, but there were African Americans. Walter White, head of the NAACP. Walter White was an African American, grew up in Atlanta. He had blonde hair and he had blue eyes. And he would pose as a traveling salesman and go to places with racial conflict, and he would write about it. The statement, I know you can't read it, on your right over here is from a book. Ida Wells Barnett published a book, a pamphlet really, about 60 pages. And she has testimony from the African Americans. By the way, you can go online and there's a PDF of it if you want to read more. It calmed down with the arrival of federal troops. Yeah. Next. In the aftermath, there is African Americans who were suspected of being in the Union were rounded up, put in a stockade in Helena, and put on trial. The African Americans were given a choice. You can either plead guilty, or we will find you guilty. Well, if you plead guilty, we'll send you to the penitentiary. If you don't plead guilty, we will try you, convict you, and sentence you to death. These 12 men refused to plead guilty. And Ida Wells looks at them, and she says, these men were sitting on cotton fields worth about $100,000 at the time. And she says that is why they're singled out, because they are prosperous. The Supreme Court vacated their convictions, these 12, ordered new trials, and new trials never happened. The 75 who were sentenced to the penitentiary, they still had to serve their time. Next slide. The memory of what happened at Elaine survived. And in the 1930s, sharecroppers in eastern Arkansas tried to form a union again. And this one was formed in 1934 in just northwest of Memphis, and it was called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the STFU. Your kids and grandkids will probably tell you STFU means something else today. But originally it was the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And this time it was blacks and whites together. It was a biracial union, whites and blacks. And the people at the founding meeting in 1934 at the Sunnyside Plantation, one of the African Americans said, yeah, I was at Elaine. We cannot have blacks and whites separate. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, by the way, then it transforms into another union called UCAPAWA, United Cannery Agricultural Workers, etc. And then by the 1940s, it's a union called the FTA, Food, Tobacco, and Allied Agricultural Workers of America. By the way, it's the leftist, most red union you can imagine, but that's beside our point here. And so this is the emergence with the STFU, is the emergence of the modern civil rights movement in Arkansas. And next slide. The elite respond to the STFU. They have to figure out new ways to respond. The guy on your left, his name is Vance Muse. And the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation, the Arkansas Chamber of Commerce brought Vance Muse into Arkansas in the early 1940s to combat the STFU. Vance Muse's grandson later would write in the Texas Monthly, "My father was an anti-Semite, a white supremacist, and someone who beat on unions because he was paid to do so. Vance Muse's organization was called Christian American Association. And what they said is this. They said that Russian communists were coming into the Arkansas Delta to stir up race problems, to launch a revolution to get rid of white people. And for them, communists and Jews were synonymous. And Christianity was a way to fight these Jewish communists trying to incite African Americans. Christian Americans with Muse, with the support of the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation and the Chamber of Commerce, they have two big legislative victories in the early 1940s. One is an anti-labor violence bill. What they are doing is they are saying that these trade unionists are the violent ones, and the Farm Bureau Federation, which is all planters, by the way, it's reactionary. They're the peaceful ones. That law makes anyone walking a picket line criminally liable for any violence that occurs. Strikebreakers, not criminally liable. Management, not criminally liable. Strikers can go to the penitentiary if there's any violence. Additionally, Arkansas's first right, the nation's first right to work law is in Arkansas. And it is part of this effort to undermine sharecropper unions. Next slide. This is what Vance Muse says is about Arkansas's right to work law. That is Arkansas's law in particular. And what this does is it sets the stage for the gains of African Americans after the war. Next slide. Oh, okay, I'm going to finish up by telling you a story. In 1945, December, the successor of the STFU, the FTA, Food, Tobacco, Allied Agricultural Workers, they organized people who were working in cotton oil mills. You crush cotton seed to make shortening. Snowdrift shortening, Wesson Oil, they have a series of these cotton oil mills across the South, and one in Little Rock, and that is the Southern Cotton Oil Mill. It's part of a multinational corporation. And the FTA, the same people who had been in the fields, are now in Little Rock working in cotton processing. And they go on a strike. Because agricultural processors are exempt from federal minimum wage laws, federal overtime laws, they went on strike saying, we want the federal minimum wage and we want time and a half for everything over 40. Strikebreakers were brought in, and there was a confrontation in late December 1945. Four strikebreakers confront two strikers. One of the strikebreakers takes out a knife, stabs a striker 20 times, leaves him for dead on the street of Little Rock. The county prosecutor exonerates the strikebreaker, self-defense, and then prosecutes 6 people on the picket line 75 yards away from the incident. these men are sent to the penitentiary. Actually, they're sentenced to the penitentiary. And what happens because of this is every trade unionist in the state, white or black, they see this and they rally to this man's defense, these men's defense. African Americans, Daisy and Elsie Bates, take the African American and rally to this man's defense. And they recreate this statewide, this black labor alliance. By the way, these convicted men, the pamphlets over here, you can't see their pictures. I apologize for that. The trade unionists, white and black, fund their appeals. They go to the Arkansas Supreme Court twice, the U.S. Supreme Court twice. Appeals are still ongoing, and Sid McMath finally pardons them on his last act in office. But this is the creation of literally Arkansas's civil rights movement. After this, blacks and trade unionists work together. It's not always the best relationship, but it holds. It is this labor-black alliance, for instance, that gets rid of the poll tax, that is at the forefront of integration. Want to hear about how Little Rock's bus line was integrated? Unions bought the bus line and integrated it. But I have a larger point here. And that larger point is the advances of civil rights in this state happen only through biracial working class alliances. Absolutely. Go back to the founding of the STFU and those people in that schoolyard or that school building. They said if we remain separate, we're dead. And so what I want to suggest to you, and what I want to leave you with, is if we think of what happened at Elaine, not as race relations, and race relations is a term that strips economics out of the equation. Race relations decontextualizes what happens. But if we think of this in terms of both race and class, something completely different emerges. And so I guess that's where I want to leave you with. I guess I have 5 minutes. Yes, you do. Any questions? Suzanne gets to pick.
I'll get to both of you.
So I'm rereading Mike Honey's book, Going Down Jericho Road.
Yeah.
Right now, and so I'm trying to understand if in the biracial coming together of the union workers here in Arkansas. I'm at the part now in the book, the AFL and the CIO were just totally split over allowing black workers to join unions. Was one ahead of the other, or, I mean?
Well, the CIO, absolutely, the CIO. But in Arkansas is different. The labor movement in the post-war is headed up by a Teamster. His name's Odell Smith. And the Teamsters in Arkansas were at the forefront of this Black Labor Alliance. In fact, this is something that is really kind of fascinating. In 1953, Odell Smith, the head of the Teamsters, is trying to get Sid McMath elected to the Senate and replacing John McClellan. And so Odell Smith goes to the heads of the CIO and the AFL and says, give me organizers and money. We have to get as many African Americans to vote as possible. And so the AFL and the CIO both send money to Arkansas and organizers, and they buy poll tax receipts that are distributed to African American voters so they can vote. And so what's going on here is these trade unionists are empowering African Americans. So the trade unionists, who do they hate? John McClellan. They hate John McClellan more than anything. How does John McClellan beat Sid McMath in 54? How does John McClellan respond? He goes after the Teamsters. John McClellan's Teamsters hearings are a way for him to cover his political base in Arkansas. And when I say that, Jimmy Hoffa was as corrupt as any man in America. Dave Beck were. But of the universe of corrupt people in this nation, why does John McClellan focus on them? John McClellan used the Teamsters hearings in order to secure his political base in Arkansas, in order to prevent black empowerment. And there's a lot of talk these days about Joe Biden and James Eastland. The only person who used more vile, racist language in the United States Senate was John McClellan. He hated unions and he hated blacks. And that's what pushes these groups together. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I answered something.
What part did the Ku Klux Klan take part in?
Well, in Arkansas, there are three versions of the Klan. There's the Reconstruction version of the Klan, which is in the 1860s and the 1870s. And that is basically a paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party that is trying to get rid of Republican rule. And that basically dies out. During the Great War, what's the movie? Birth of a Nation comes out. And a bunch of fraternal people create the Second Klan. And the Second Klan is distinct. And this Second Klan, by the way, they control Arkansas state government for much of the 1920s. And this Second Klan, they are more holistic. They don't simply hate African Americans, they hate trade unions. They hate Catholics. They hate people who violate prohibition. And so that Second Klan, who do they go after? Trade unionists and blacks and people who drink. Most famously in 1923, the Klan lynches white trade unionists in Harrison, and then takes the rest of these. I know it's Harrison. You know, it's anti-unionism and anti-black coming together, and then they march. They march 100 trade union members to the border under armed guards and tell them never to come back to Arkansas. In 1923, during the shopman strike in North Little Rock, the Ku Klux Klan becomes the anti-union strikebreakers. And then the third version of the Klan comes with the modern civil rights movement, and a totally different, Oh, and in Little Rock, they bomb a couple people, and they're also not only anti-black, they're anti-union.
Hi, I was curious how much of all this has made it into our Arkansas school textbooks.
I don't know where Jeannie is. It's slowly making its ways in. I think the textbooks for elementary and junior high kids do a very, very good job talking about race. I think they do a horrible, horrible job talking about trade unions, economic issues, the ways that Arkansas has been long governed and controlled by a small economic elite. Up and probably until 1970. And by the way, and who got Dale Bumpers elected in 1970? A coalition of blacks and trade unionists and J. William Fulbright supporters. But so it all comes back. College textbooks are better. I think the big college Arkansas history textbook is doing a much better job than it did.
There is an Arkansas history textbook written by Sharecroppers that does a good job of covering this and actually has articles that tells people not to talk about the riot that happened in Elaine. So Sharecroppers has written an Arkansas textbook focused on the middle and junior high level, and it's very well done.
Yeah, you can get that from University of Arkansas Press, McElroy House. If you just go knock on their door, they'll sell you a copy. Yeah.
You can't, but tell you what, a bunch of us have to run to worship, but we'll get one more question in, and if I have to run before
I
to hear
can
the
stay.
answer, well, thank you. Listen to that. He'll stay for those of you who could stay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if this should be for the whole.